This is a section of a 1-hour, 38-minute-long DVD production on the Union Pacific Railroad. Their high standards left a lasting impression on the public, in part due to E.H. Harriman's influence. Let's drop back to the World War II era when steam was king and review the many advancements in their motive power.
The SP went off on its own, but with improved direction from Harriman's involvement. SP and UP would cooperate for many years and co-own the Pacific Fruit Express refrigerator car company. The UP continued to prosper as many other roads went in and out of receiverships and bankruptcies. The opening of the Panama Canal in Harriman's day was direct competition to transcontinental freight business, but in time of war, rails were a secure corridor for the war effort, all without the risks that ships using the Panama Canal would have from submarine attacks. Number 2264 is a 282 mic from the Common Standards era on a Cajon Pass westbound, followed by 5518, a 1924-built Baldwin 210-2. World War II showcased how railroads could tie a large country together, coast to coast, as one efficient war production machine. The U.S. railroads operated in a relative calm to transport troops and war material from coast to coast. The importance of railroads in wartime is illustrated by these Allied attacks on German rails to disrupt their war capacity. This is something that U.S. railroads didn't have to contend with, and they went about their business without concern, except for the risk of sabotage. The war took Depression-level business and tripled it, and even after the war, the volume per freight remained high. This 282 was a Harriman-era common standard design that was still running in 1955. The back of the tender is lettered OWR and N, Oregon Washington Railway and Navigation, which was a 1,500-mile portion of the UP system. This 1923-built Alco was originally built for the LA and Salt Lake line with a 482 wheel arrangement. It retains its history as an LA and Salt Lake locomotive with a small reporting mark at the bottom right of the cab this late in its career. The UP had an appetite for more power during the war, and this ex-Norfolk and Western Malley was one of many used on the Butte line and in helper service over Sherman Hill. These 4 664s were less suitable for fast mainline service compared to the Challenger class and big boy models. This is a World War I vintage Baldwin 282 with a local. It carried 9,000 gallons of water. The frequent stops for water to keep locomotives under steam was one reason for the eventual dieselization. UP began replacing road power with diesels by 1947 with the EMD F3 model. They skipped over the earlier FT version since they were well equipped with modern steam power during the war. The F3s were much improved over the FTs. Steam would still have work, especially in helper service, until 1957, when steam classes were stored away one by one for the call that would never come again. UP worked with GE to create the turbine-powered locomotive, touted as an alternative to the diesel. The baby turbines produced 4,500 horsepower. They had a heavy appetite but could run on cheaper Bunker C fuel oil. These had a total of 8 traction motors. The UP liked the idea of heavy fast power to run its trains in the busy Omaha to Ogden corridor. The fact that they consumed great amounts of fuel sitting in a siding was no concern for this double-tracked line. Trains simply should not sit idle in the first place. The last group of 30 were the 8,500 horsepower Big Blow models, built in 1958 to 61. These were essentially jet engines that produced electric power for the traction motors. They had a deafening roar that made them unpopular in heavily populated areas, and the availability time wasn't as high as their contemporary diesels. They were all off the roster by 1969. The grand experiment was over. By then, EMD had been offering turbocharger-equipped diesels that produced more power, such as these 1963-built Jeep 30s. GE had already shifted its emphasis to diesel production, and a horsepower race was on. When these 1947-built F3s were new, EMD was offering 1,500 horsepower with good product reliability. To maintain reliability, they would resist using turbochargers with the Roots blower-equipped diesel for another 12 years when the Jeep 20 was offered. The F3 had the company of 56 of the newer F7 and FP7 models until 1963, when the F3s were retired or rebuilt as F7 or F9 versions. Alco was a longtime supplier of steam power, and during the war, they were restricted from offering diesel road power. This is a mix of Alco PA, FB, and PB units that were turbocharged diesels. They were built in the 1948 period, and the P models for passenger service offered 2,000 horsepower. UP only bought 14 PA and PB units. In many regards, they were great locomotives, but they suffered from early crankshaft and exhaust manifold failures. During the War Production Board did allow Alco to offer switch engines. The rest of their manufacturing capacity was assigned to building steam locomotives. While the decision served the country's needs well, it gave EMD a heavy edge over Alco that would haunt them to the end. The 1,000 horsepower turbocharged 6-cylinder diesel was a successful model for Alco, and they sold 54 to UP alone. These switchers with the characteristic Alco 4-cycle sound were reliable and liked by engineers. They spent their years picking around in small yards and industries, doing all the unglamorous work of feeding the system. The UP gave Alco another order for the similar S4 model in 1955, and they bought 45 more switchers. All the S model units were eventually retired in the early 70s. UP had GE and EMD diesels to maintain, and a third brand that was by then out of business was deemed unneeded. But the S model series sold almost 2,300 total in North America. This Santa Fe S4 had a similar story, and many of these Alcos run today on short lines. EMD first sold UP switchers in 1939 to 1942. This NW2 delivered 1,000 horsepower from 12 cylinders and was not turbocharged. UP owned 96 of these by 1948. UP operated 8 sets of 1951-built cow and calf TR5s for transferring cuts of cars between yards. The two units gave 1,200 horsepower total. This concept was replaced with the coming of the GP model series from EMD. The UP owned 30 Jeep 7s built in 1953. They quickly shifted railroad buying habits to the GP, or general purpose concept. This gave better operating utility and easier maintenance compared to the F7 locomotives that were otherwise identical in performance. These two 1,500 horsepower Jeeps eased past a water column for steam engines that would lose its purpose in a few more years. From 1954 to 1957, UP bought 324 GP9s that brought 1,750 horsepower and minor improvements over the original concept. They were useful switching yards and running on the main line with the most important freight trains. This dual mode was something unthinkable for F units. Borrowing an idea from the F units, they were offered in A and B or cabless versions. 5 were equipped with steam generators for reserve passenger duty. These Jeeps were the first volume-produced road switchers for EMD and the last to satisfy a market without resorting to turbocharging. trains were growing in tonnage, facing stiff competition from trucks, and rail shippers were requiring faster service. The GE experiments with turbine power and turbocharged offerings from Alco gave a strong message to EMD. Huge locomotive consists appeal to rail fans, but not the cost accountants. In heavy grade locations, the UP didn't want to resort to helper locomotives as readily as the Santa Fe. Avoiding extra facilities and crews for helpers, plus the increased load of dispatching light power sets, was a matter of business style. By the late 60s, GP9s would be assigned to flatter assignments and locals. UP not only encouraged EMD to develop more powerful models, they also worked on their own to prove the value of turbocharging without sacrificing reliability. This Jeep 9 is one of 75 that were turboed by UP's shops to produce 2,000 horsepower. The ordinary Jeep was about to share its assignments with a better breed. EMD started the development of the SD24 and the Jeep 20 models that would emerge by 1959 to compete in a market demanding more output per unit. The Jeep 20 was a 2,000 horsepower model with the new standard low front hood, and it resulted in 30 sales to the UP. By 1963, the 2,250 horsepower and more advanced Jeep 30 with its peculiar roof and cab styling was brought in with 76 units, almost evenly divided between A and B versions. They weren't perfect, but they started the long climb toward EMD domination of the 4-axle road switcher market. The EMD Jeep 20 was rated at 2,000 horsepower, and the Jeep 30 was somewhat misleading at 2,250. The original designation was to be the Jeep 22, but with GE's release of the 2,500 horsepower U25B, the number 22 somehow seemed to be a marketing problem. EMD claimed that 30 was the proper number to indicate the 30 new improvements in the design. The third unit back is a Jeep 35 that was the last offering from EMD in 1963 using the 567 series diesel. The yellow Sperry rail car is visiting UP tracks in the LA area to provide its rail testing services. This special type of car uses magnetic induction to find defects in the rails before they become a safety problem. The service began in 1928 from original work and patents from Dr. Sperry, also known for his famous work with gyroscopes and navigational equipment. Let's return to Daggett, California, where the UP swings off Santa Fe's double tracks to its own line off to Las Vegas, Nevada. The Jeep 30 had an elaborate positive pressure air system to keep dust and dirt out of the engine room, which explains its lack of the expected numerous louvers on the side panels. Later, a westbound is headed by an SD24, which did produce 2,400 horsepower from its 16-cylinder 567D diesel. UP wanted 6-axle locomotives that could pull well up grades and also run at fast freight speeds. It was introduced in 1959, and UP bought 34 with a larger order for the 45B units. The rival Santa Fe bought 80 SD24s, but only UP bought the B units. The SD24 is easy to spot in either A or B versions by the 4 roof-mounted air tanks. To get a 3,000-gallon tank between the pair of 3-axle trucks, the air tanks wound up on the roof. It was either that or lengthen the frame. The second unit here is a Jeep 35 with EMD's 2500 horsepower version of the 567 diesel. This would be the most expected from a 567 without adding cylinders. The only step up from this power rating was the double diesel with 2 Jeep 35s built into one long frame. The 5,000 horsepower single chassis dual engine was called the DD35. At first it was only offered as a B unit, and SP and UP were the only customers for this solution for more power. UP owned the only cab units, totaling 15. The DD35s were a stopgap measure for bigger things to come from EMD. Despite the low population of the DD35s, they seemed to be everywhere on UP's Western Front from 1965 until they retired around 1981. Another potential supplier was Fairbanks Morris with its unusual but powerful opposed piston diesel. These 2,400 horsepower demonstration Trainmasters were tested on the UP in 1953. It didn't result in sales to the UP, but this pair was bought by the Southern Pacific along with 14 others. Union Pacific's appetite for heavy turbine power was a strong factor in GE eventually breaking into diesel production. They had a long and good reputation for building pure electric locomotives, such as this Milwaukee box cab. They were very durable if a railroad was willing to build and maintain the overhead wiring to feed them. GE split up its engineering partnership with Alco and continued on as a mere supplier of electrical parts for Alco diesels. The GE traction motors were one of Alco's advantages. They could take a lot of abuse without problems. These Alco RS-27 demonstration diesels were bought by UP in 1961, but they would be retired in only 10 years. The last Alcos bought by UP were the Century models in 1966. They didn't make a good impression on the UP, and Alco would be out of business in short order. GE introduced their own diesel line and introduced the U-boat to the railroad world using the Cooper-Bessemer diesel. UP's 10 U-28Cs looked good on paper, but they suffered the same problems that the U-25B had earlier. A company the size of General Electric had the deep resources to work out problems and support their early units with warranty and trade-in plans. The U-boat nickname was coined after the U in the model designation, U meaning universal. The U-series was just a first step for GE, and they would continue on with newer lines into the 80s and 90s. Eventually, GE would begin to eclipse EMD as a builder, but these U-28s were off the main line by the early 70s and off the roster by 1980. Here's a look at GE's bare rooftop on the U-28C compared to the various trailing EMDs here at Barstow. In 1963, GE built 23 special U-50Bs using 4 B trucks and a pair of 2,500 horsepower diesels to form the 5,000 horsepower monster that UP hoped would allow a 3-unit set to handle any train on the system. The idea was based on studies that each diesel added to a train had a fixed operating cost increment that was independent of its horsepower, so adding fewer units with higher power ratings could offer a savings. The span bolsters and trucks on these machines came from retired GE turbines. The second generation U-50C had a pair of 3-axle trucks taken from the retired big blow turbines. They had 6 versus 8 traction motors, and they were better suited for using their power generating speed instead of tractive effort. The U-50C diesels were turned around to put the radiators in the center, giving them a different look. Let's watch a pair of U-50Cs at speed near North Platte. EMD filled orders for double diesels, and the DDA40X was its finest example. The 6900 was used to pull the 1969 Golden Spike Centennial Special passenger train from Kansas City to Salt Lake City. It used 2 3,300 horsepower 645 series diesels to give 6,600 horsepower total. The project was accelerated to bring the unit to the ceremonies, and it was on display as the world's most powerful land vehicle. In a few months, men would walk on the moon, but for the time being, the DD40 was the giant step for UP. On to Los Angeles for more public viewing. This was a Union Pacific model, and it was not listed in the EMD catalogs. Many of its electrical improvements would come in future EMD single-engine diesels. The Dash 2 line of EMD locomotives that were so successful in the 70s can trace their advantages to this locomotive. A hot eastbound TOFC is nearing the crest at Summit on Cajon Pass, using only 2 locomotives to conquer the 2.2% grade. EMD learned a lot by building the 47 DDA40X machines, filling a need for power until the next generation of single-engine diesels could come close to their performance. The DD35 was an earlier EMD design to compete with the U50 model from GE. It was the internal workings of two 2,500 horsepower Jeep 35s on one long chassis to furnish 5,000 horsepower. This was the last and greatest hurrah for the 567 series diesel from EMD. These were built as cabless boosters in 1964 and later offered with cabs in 1965. UP owned 42 total and ran them into the early 80s. The SP was the only other customer for them, and they only owned 3 of the cabless version. This ABB trio is working its way down the 3% grade on the south track on Cajon Pass. Off in the distance, another UP train is climbing the easier 2.2% grade on the north track with a more conventional SD40 on the point and a second DD35B. After all of UP's experimentation with heavy power, the 3,000 horsepower SD40-2 would eventually emerge as the standard for UP's road power. In 1972, UP started buying 682 of them. Down at the bottom of the Cajon grade at Devore, a passing eastbound Santa Fe train is about to begin its grind up the mountain as a pair of DD40s work their way down towards San Bernardino. Back up at Summit, the two tracks split up to take different alignments. This is where the south track converges back with the north track down at Cajon. Compared to the 2.2% north track, the south track grade is 3%, so it's used mostly for westbound traffic heading down grade. Before 1913, the south track was the original single line for all traffic. The second track adds several miles of extra length and a pair of short tunnels, but it cuts the grade down to a more reasonable 2.2%. The 3% grade shows its presence with lots of brake smoke. Off to the train's right is Sullivan's Curve in the north track. Visible to the left is a remnant of the old Route 66 that was broken up by Interstate 15, seen with the heavy traffic above. Smoking it up in Barstow is the same power combination we saw at Cajon.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to help bring more YouTube content, and feel free to browse on our website. Thanks for watching.